is Tyler Bublitz, and welcome back to the second Sunday of Easter for the week of April 12th, 2026. I'm excited to have you here. I'm excited to begin this week's podcast, and I am excited that we are now in the beginnings here of this Easter season. It is such a great time. He is risen indeed. We can keep saying that. We are Easter people. Hallelujah. That's what's so awesome about this season, this time, this recognition of what Christ did. And we're going to be walking through that here the next few weeks. And I think it's vitally important for us to start trying to grapple with and understanding this, not just intellectually in the aspect of what it means scripturally and just putting that to mind. I think it really means that we need to put it into our bones. We need to get it deep within us and recognize how that is affecting our day-to-day lives going forward and how that impacts us even still to this day. I think these are the things that are vitally important for us to be able to be contemplating, working on, thinking about consistently, and especially in this Easter season. That's what is important, and it will lead into what we're talking about this week because this all comes back around. And I love that about the Revised Common Lectionary, that we come back around to a lot of these subjects and they kind of flow into each other. So let's take a look back to the question that we had for last week, which was, how are you being an Easter person consistently? And there was a great answer that I got this last week, and I think it's really important, is making sure that we're giving enough forgiveness to people. And I would even argue in certain ways that also means giving grace. I think there's times where we're really quick to judge, we're really quick to make assumptions about other people. But in that, it means it also can make it so that we harden our own heart. We start seeing ourselves better than other people. And I would argue that's not what our role is. That's not what we're supposed to be about. And so thus, the idea of being able to forgive, the idea of being able to have a soft heart and living that out, I think is a great way of really showing what it's like to be an Easter person consistently. Day in, day out, it's not easy. We all fall short. But I think it's that aspect of recognition and realizing that that is something that we fall short in and then working on it. And I think that in and of itself is a very admirable goal for all of us to be working on. And it's an amazing aspect of showing that we are truly Easter people. So let's just jump into it this week. The first reading this week is not even out of the Old Testament. We are in that season where we are digging wholeheartedly into the New Testament, and I love it. The first reading then is out of Acts chapter 2, starting with verse 14a, and then we're skipping to verse 22 through 32. So just getting the context here at verse 14 that Peter is making an announcement to a large group of Israelites. He then starts in 22 laying out again, I watched Jesus of Nazareth get arrested, die. I saw all these different amazing things of what Christ had done while living and was crucified and then was raised from the dead. And in doing this, that this should be something for us that gives us encouragement. This is something that is hopeful. This is also something that should be empowering us to move forward. This is not something that is necessarily diminishing. It's Christ overcoming Satan, Christ overcoming Hades, this recognition of now we are able to walk confidently in what is going on. And Peter then also is recognizing how David was showing this. It was prophesied multiple times coming out of the line of David, recognizing what is going to happen out of this. And now we can say this happened. And so this should be an empowerment for us to recognize and being able to witness to that, recognizing that we were told this was going to happen, it did happen, and thus now we need to be able to take that information and do something with it. It should change how we live based off of that. The psalm then this week is Psalm 16, all 11 verses of it, and this is resting in the Lord. Recognizing that the Lord is protecting us, recognizing that God is providing for us, recognizing that everything that goes on is out of God gifting it to us, that our heritage and where we're coming from, the recognition of how we are able to rejoice and be glad is gifts from God, recognizing what is all around us is gifts from God, and that this is something that illuminates our path and continues to move us and steer us toward directions of praise, and recognizing our dependence on God further and further as it changes us, molds us, moves us into new directions. The second reading, or typically the epistle text, then is from 1 Peter chapter 1, starting in verse 3 through 9. And again, this is a recognition that with Christ's death, we are born into a new life. We are brought into the life of the living, the Easter people that we are. That this should be, again, something that we're rejoicing in. It gives us a genuine faith. It gives us a richness to our relationship with God and being able to give praise and honor to God, and brings us closer to God. In doing all of this, recognizing what Christ did for us so that we can never repay it, and yet it's building the relationship back and forth. And I think in a lot of ways, this is something that we can relate to, where there are times within our lives that we think about and recognize that people do things for us that we can never repay them for. And this is on that scale, just multiplied multiple times X for what Christ did for us. We rejoice in that. We are thankful for that. And we continue to recognize that. The gospel text this week is out of John chapter 20, verses 19 through 31. This picks up a little bit kind of where we were last week, but it's coming from John's perspective. This is also a week that gets kind of known as Doubting Thomas. I would not say that. And I know we've talked about it before, of more like scientific Thomas, or looking at it from a different perspective. But it's this recognition on, here we are, we have the disciples, they're all gathered together. Jesus appears in front of them and suddenly and says, "Peace be with you." And this is considered the night after his resurrection. And they are able to see the holes in his hand and his side. He breathes on them and states, "Receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive the sins of any, you are forgiven them. If you retain the sins of any, they are retained." All of them are there but Thomas. And the other disciples then go and tell him about this. He says, "Unless I can see the marks in his hand and put my hand in his side where it's been marked, I will not believe." So 1 week later, they are all together. Thomas is there. Jesus reappears, says, "Peace be with you." Then Jesus walks up to Thomas and tells him, "Put your finger in the holes of my hand. Reach out your hand and put it in my side. Do not doubt, but believe." Thomas responds with, "My Lord and my God." And then we get the very familiar text here, starting in verse 29. "Have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have come to believe." And then we get the end of John's gospel. Now, Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples that are not written in this book, but these are written so that you may come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that through believing you may have life in his name. This recognition on how this is the last miracle, if you want to say it that way, on how John is presenting it, that Jesus is appearing in front of all of us still to this day. And that blessed are we that we are able to recognize and come to believe without necessarily physically seeing Jesus right there. But before we jump into how faith and science come together, this week I have to do a shameless plugs. Working Preacher, if you haven't checked out Working Preacher, I'd highly recommend it. Between their Sermon Brainwaves podcasts, their commentaries, their discussions. Since I'm not an ordained minister, I use them on a weekly basis to help give me some ideas, direction, different commentaries to look at and to think about. And especially with the back catalog that they have, it's a very useful resource. Between their Working Preacher podcast, again, lots of back episodes to that, and then all these commentaries, and having a lot of great just general preaching resources. So if you haven't checked out workingpreacher.org, I'd highly recommend it. I'd also highly recommend checking out the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Divinity Library. I really enjoy how they lay out the text week to week, but along with the art, prayers, hymns, colors, but also daily readings to get you prepared for Sunday morning or whenever your worship day is, getting into these texts, starting to prepare, thinking about them. The more that we are able to do the prep work, the more we're able to get out of those services, and that is extremely helpful. I would also recommend with this, it gives us great resources, again, looking at liturgical art on how different people artistically have interpreted these texts or have utilized these texts in art throughout the world. It's extremely helpful. So if you haven't checked out the revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Divinity Library, I'd highly recommend that as well. Finally, I'd also highly recommend checking out the Green Blades Preaching Roundtable and the Green Blades Rising publication. This is either a weekly reflection or a monthly newsletter covering ecological echoes, implications, and urgencies within the weekly lectionary, just like I do similar here on this podcast. But along with then having the newsletter, having some different events and different other green tips and things of that nature. If you enjoy listening to this podcast for a half an hour each week, I have a feeling you're really going to enjoy the resources over there at Green Blades Preaching Roundtable and the Green Blades Rising publication. Those will be the first links down in the show notes, and make sure to take a look and check that out and sign up for it. It's a great, great resource. I understand why this is always the second Sunday of Easter. I do. But I've really come to recognize this is a very familiar story on what we assume Thomas is going through. And yet I've come to more and more not like this story. I've more and more come to realize that there's too much prejudgment, at least in all the different things that I grew up hearing about with this story, that at times it makes it difficult for me to look at it with fresh eyes. But I think this year I have figured out something that at least gives me some more grace and forgiveness to Thomas. And I think in a lot of ways it helps all of us give a little bit of grace and forgiveness. And I know in years past I have talked about it as Thomas is coming more from a scientific perspective, and I could argue that. But I think there's also some things that are going on physically with Thomas that I think we need to be able to work through as well. And I think especially as we are looking at and thinking about these disciples, and especially with what we have heard over the last few weeks, again, I think we need to go to the brain and think about what is going on there. And the more that we're able to understand what is going on in the brain, even at a high level, I think helps us better understand, one, how to be better disciples, two, give more grace to what the disciples were going through, and three, be able to work on it in our day-to-day lives as these types of things come up. What Jesus is wanting out of his disciples is neuroplasticity. Period. What Jesus is wanting is neuroplasticity. And now, what is that? That is the ability for the brain to evolve and change. And this has been something over the last 20 to 30 years has been major research done on this. And especially even not that long ago, we thought that once you got to about your teenage years, the brain was basically fixed. There was no more changing and evolving to the brain. And we found that that was completely wrong. Our brain is constantly evolving and changing every day, all the time. And thus, it helps us to recognize that this is something that for us to constantly be working on. But in order for that to happen, we have to understand what is going on. Now, in order for neuroplasticity to happen, there is 3 different things that can be happening in the brain that changes the result. So first, we can have chemical changes in the brain. So this can be something like pretend that you are practicing an instrument or working on a particular skill, and you just keep repeating it. And in that session, you recognize that you are getting better. Now, what can be happening is you have your neurons up in the brain and you have what they call action potential, these releases of what we're going to say then is neurotransmitters, the chemical in between these neurons that help be able to pass that message. And then you have axon terminals on the other side, the next neuron, and they have receptors to be able to grab that chemical. Now, as you are doing these things, you can have chemical shifts, which can be that you have more action potential. We have more ways that it's going to be released and easier for that neurotransmitter to be released. We can have the amount of neurotransmitter that there's more and more in that synapse, that gap in between the neurons, that there's more and more of that. So thus, it makes it easier for that synapse to be able to connect at the axon terminal on the other side to be able to bring that in on the receptacles. Or finally, that we have a change where you have more receptacles on the other side. So thus you are more sensitive to the neurotransmitters, making it easier for that synapse to fire. We have to remember what we're looking at is trying to get these things to fire, being able to move that through. You are being able to have some type of action happen because of that. Thus, the easier it is for those things to fire, the easier it is for that reaction or what the brain is wanting you to do. So that's one part of it. There's the chemical. There's the structural. Now, this is like thinking about that there are probably habits and things that you did as a child that you don't do now. Well, what's happened? As a child, there was a repeated path and something that was easy. And over time, you can adjust it. So if you think about it from an aspect of, say you're working in a sport on something, and you are having a coach saying you need to make this tweak to how you're throwing a ball or how you're swinging a bat or how you're shooting a shot. And at first that's really difficult because you have so many of these structural paths. The way that you typically fire is the one way, and you're trying to adjust it. You're trying to change that, and that takes time and more practice. And like we stated, we can have the chemicals so that initially in one session, maybe you're doing really well, but to make that structural change can take some time. To be able to make this change on how your brain is firing these things consistently takes time. This is a major part of like drug recovery. You're trying to change habits. So then there is that structural aspect of it. And again, if we want to get back into the neurons themselves, we have dendrites that is on the receptacle being able to have like these tentacles looking for the neurotransmitters, looking for the different action potentials to be able to connect with the axon terminals. And the more you do that, the more of them there will be there so that they're really looking for that. And you'll be able to see this complex web of all these dendrites coming together like a big tree. Or if you're having something where you're getting rid of it and you're not going down that path as much, some of those dendrites might start dying off or breaking off, and thus it isn't as strong of a synapse as it once was. Finally, we also then have functional changes. The longer that you do this, the changes how you are doing things. It changes how your body is reacting, and thus it changes how your brain is working. And then over time, it can help things for the better or for worse and change how you are seeing things. This then gets into, we are all people who want to have healthy brains. We all want to be able to do these things. So what is it? Well, part of it is changing our behavior and making sure that we are doing things that is prepping the brain and trying to get it going and challenging ourselves. One of the things that I was listening to a TED Talk from Laura Boyd, who is a brain scientist up in Canada. She was talking about how part of this that we have to get accustomed to and used to is the struggle and difficulty of something. The more we're going through that, it seems to prime the brain to actually be able to learn more, and also it changes the structure of our brain more. Now, granted, within all of us, we each have different biomarkers, different things that allow for change to happen easier or not. And some of that's genetic. But also this means that as we are looking at and studying the brain, it gets us back to the idea of how we are needing to personalize medicine, maybe even personalize education, based on the fact that each of our brains are different. So thus, let's customize the learning to those brains personally. Because as I was listening to another TED Talk coming from Daniel Amen, who is a psychologist, the impact of what we are able to learn about your brain and help your brain does not just impact you. It impacts future generations. Because if you are healthier, the people you're interacting with and potentially your kin and your kin's kin are going to be impacted by how you are reacting. And so thus you are making impact long after you are gone. And I think we think about that and recognize that. I mean, heck, we can even see that with the disciples. And is that not where we're getting out of these texts this week? That we are a changed people. That we should, because of what has happened, we should be different. Things have changed. So thus we need to act that way. We need to live that out. We need to recognize that. And we see that in 1 Peter and in the Acts reading. Let's be honest. How does this all come back to Thomas? Thomas, I think, was struggling with neuroplasticity at that moment. And I think a lot of the disciples were. It's just this is where we're getting it talked about. We saw it with Peter a few weeks ago. Peter denied Christ 3 times because he was scared and saving his own life. And then he goes and cries. Why? Because everything that Peter had known up to that point had suddenly shifted. Thomas doesn't want to necessarily believe even what his closest friends are telling him. Because everything that he has known up to that point states that Jesus is dead. There is nothing that can happen to resurrect this. And yes, he saw Lazarus, he saw these different things, but crucifixion was the death of deaths that was more brutal, and not even a Roman citizen could go through it. You had to be outside of the Romans because it was too brutal of a death. It's the brutal of the brutal. It is the worst way to die. It is death by suffocation. There is no coming back from that in Thomas's brain. Thomas was probably figuring out, I've spent 3 years of my life following around this man. There has been so much I've learned, but now what do I do? How do I explain this gap in my resume? What do I say? He's seen as a criminal. And then the disciples are coming up and talking to him about Jesus has risen. Yeah, let me put my fingers in his hands and put my hand in his side. Give me a break. I'm trying to figure out how I'm moving forward with my life. Don't bring me back. I'm trying to retrain these synapses. I'm trying to figure out everything that I've known in my brain doesn't work anymore. Jesus is gone. I need to retrain my brain. And Jesus says otherwise. Jesus says, yes, the way that you were interpreting what we did together needs to be retrained. What you are thinking is the death of what happened to me means that this is over. That needs to be thrown out because your understanding of death and what faith is and what your connection with God is needs to be reprogrammed. It needs to be go through and reevaluated. We need some neuroplasticity so that you are able to start to grapple with and understand that this is much bigger and much different than what you thought it was. It's not nearly as black and white as you thought it was. What you understood as death was the end is not the end. And on top of that, what you were understanding this faith and what the last 3 years have been, yes, there is more changes that need to be happening. And it's not you going back to your old life. It's you now living out your new life of what you have been called into that is drastically different. This neuroplasticity within the brain of those 12 disciples, and we could even argue like Mary Magdalene and Paul, these others who then have interactions with Jesus as the risen Christ, are the reason that we are here today. Like we stated earlier, the psychology of what has gone on is that you are affecting a brain that's going to affect then generations after. Jesus had to have the people understand that the way that they were retraining and re-looking at faith and thinking about their interaction with God, their connection with God, was the whole purpose of this. And in doing that, Jesus also had to transform how they were thinking about faith in general, how they were thinking about their connection with God, and recognizing that this was a complete transformation. This is a game changer. I think in our lives, we can recognize and see that some. I think we can recognize and think about how these things happen to us and change us, and that is necessary. And in order for us to move forward effectively, we have to acknowledge that. And in order for us to live into the faith and live into the life of where God is calling us, we need to be able to slowly, continually learn and grow and adapt and continue to adapt and to continue to change and recognize that that is the habit of growth that God is desiring for us. It's not this stagnant faith. It's an ever-growing faith, ever-evolving faith, ever-changing faith as we go deeper and deeper and deeper. Because we see the more we go down these different synapses, they don't stay the same. They create more dendrites. They make stronger webs. They make stronger connections. There's more receptors, more neurotransmitters, more action potential, more things that are changing, allowing that path to become stronger and stronger and stronger, making that reaction easier and easier and easier, being able to anticipate it more and more and more. That's what we're going for. And at some point, God says, okay, this is a very strong aspect of it, but there's a few things that we need to modify. We need to cut down some of these things, and we still need to make a small detour around here. You need to get used to that. This is the faith that we're a part of. This is the part that we need to understand and grapple with. And it's hard, but it's necessary. Thomas is not necessarily doubting. Thomas is showing a brain that is starting to change and struggling with it. And I think we have all had aspects of our lives where something drastically changed our life, and we struggled for a period of time adjusting to that. We need to give grace to that, and we need to be able to understand that, and we need to understand that God is in that and allowing us to grow. So the question I have for you this week, I want to ask, when has God done something that drastically changed your life and was trying to remind you, I'm here with it, even though there's big changes that are going on? Where has God drastically changed your life at like a moment's notice? And what happened? I'm not going to get into it right now, but I know, as I kind of stated last week, my wife's family is going through some stuff right now. And it's something that, for me, I knew that when this day came, and it's not quite here yet, but it's coming closer and closer, that it was going to be very difficult. It was going to be a drastic change. There's going to be a lot of hard feelings, big feelings. But we have to remember in those times that God's still with us. God provides resources for us, and people and friends and family in our quiet times all around us, in nature. And sometimes it's very difficult, don't get me wrong. But I think it's also a good reminder for us that God does not abandon us. God is that shelter, that God is trying to help us grow and is now saying, it's time for a little bit different direction. Time for you to grow in a different way with me than what you have before. And saying goodbye to the old part of way of doing things is not always easy. It's often very difficult, but also recognizing that God's still with us and helping us to move into that new direction, to be able to continue to grow and be more and more like who God intended us to be. And that's the neuroplasticity that we're all needing to encounter and do daily in order for us to grow into the people that God is calling us into. So, we'll wrap this up as we always do. I pray God blesses you through your faith and amazes you through science.